In the scorching summer of 1887, when the Arizona Territory baked under a merciless sun that turned the desert into a furnace, a young cowboy named Samuel Wade made a decision that would change the course of his entire life. He was just 22 years old, weathered by years of hard work and harder luck, riding a borrowed horse through country so hostile it could kill a man in hours. What he didn't know was that the woman lying unconscious beside a broken-down stagecoach was Margaret Caldwell, owner of the largest railroad empire west of the Mississippi. And what happened next would not only save her life, but would transform him from a penniless drifter into one of the most powerful men in the American West. The heat that July was unlike anything the old-timers had seen before. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees, turning rocks too hot to touch and making the air shimmer like water across the endless expanse of sand, and sage cattle dropped dead in their tracks. Wells dried up overnight. Even the buzzards sought shade, waiting for the killing heat to pass. It was the kind of weather that made strong men weep and sent entire families fleeing back east, swearing they'd never return to this God-forsaken land. Samuel Wade had been riding since before dawn, pushing his mount hard across the desert floor toward the town of Copper Ridge. His water was nearly gone, his lips cracked and bleeding from the dry air, and his shirt stuck to his back with sweat that evaporated almost as soon as it formed. He'd been working cattle drives for the better part of 5 years, ever since his father died and left him with nothing but debts and a reputation for being reliable in a pinch. The job waiting for him in Copper Ridge wasn't much. Just another short-term contract moving livestock. But it was work, and work meant survival. The horse beneath him was struggling, its breath coming in short, labored gasps. Sam knew they both needed water soon, or they wouldn't make it another mile. The sun hung overhead like a white-hot coin pressed against the pale blue sky, and there wasn't a cloud in sight to offer even a moment's relief. He'd been rationing his water since sunrise, taking only small sips when the thirst became unbearable, but the leather canteen at his side felt lighter with each passing hour. That's when he saw the dust cloud rising in the distance, too thick and dark to be just wind. Something was moving out there, or had been moving until recently. Sam adjusted his hat to shield his eyes and squinted across the heat-distorted landscape. Through the shimmering air, he could make out the dark shape of what looked like a stagecoach, sitting motionless beside the main road to Tucson. His first instinct was to ride around it. Trouble had a way of finding men who went looking for it, and Sam had learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's problems usually meant making them your own. Besides, he had his own survival to worry about. Every minute he delayed in this heat was another minute closer to dying of thirst in the middle of nowhere. But something about the scene didn't sit right with him. The stagecoach sat at an odd angle, one wheel clearly broken, and there were no horses in sight. Whoever had been traveling in that coach was either dead or dying, and leaving people to die in the desert wasn't something Sam could live with. His father had raised him better than that, even if his father hadn't left him much else. He urged his horse forward, the animal's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each reluctant step. As they drew closer, Sam could see that the stagecoach was one of the fancy ones, painted black with gold trim and built for comfort rather than speed. The kind of conveyance that carried important people with important business, not the rough wooden wagons most folks used to cross the desert. The driver was nowhere to be seen, but Sam could make out a figure lying in the shade beneath the coach. From this distance, it looked like a woman. Her dark traveling dress spread around her like spilled ink against the pale sand. She wasn't moving, and for a terrible moment, Sam thought he might be too late. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, and tied his horse to the broken wheel of the coach. The animal immediately sought what little shade it could find, its sides heaving with exhaustion. Sam dropped to one knee beside the unconscious woman and placed 2 fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady, and he could see the slight rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but just barely. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and now lay damp with perspiration across her pale forehead. Her clothes were expensive. Sam could tell that much. Made from fine fabric that probably cost more than he made in 6 months. Her face was flushed red from the heat, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. All the signs of heat exhaustion, and if he didn't act quickly, it would turn into something much worse. Sam looked around for any sign of water and spotted a leather satchel that had been thrown clear when the coach broke down. Inside, he found a small silver flask, still half full of what smelled like brandy. It wasn't water, but it was liquid, and right now that was what mattered most. He also found papers scattered in the sand, official-looking documents with letterheads he didn't recognize, and numbers that seemed impossibly large. Gently, he lifted the woman's head and tried to get her to drink from the flask. Most of it ran down her chin, but she managed to swallow a small amount. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he thought she might wake up, but she remained unconscious. The heat was winning, and Sam knew they needed to get out of the sun immediately. The broken stagecoach provided some shade, but not enough, and the metal fittings were already too hot to touch safely. Sam looked around desperately for better shelter and spotted a cluster of large rocks about 50 yards away. They would provide more shade and might even have trapped some cooler air between them. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying here in the open. He gathered up the woman's scattered belongings, stuffing the papers back into her satchel along with what looked like jewelry and other valuables. Then, as carefully as he could manage, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he'd expected, but the effort of carrying her across the sand in the blazing heat left him dizzy and gasping for breath. The rocks did provide better shelter, creating a small pocket of shade that felt at least 10 degrees cooler than the open desert. Sam laid the woman down gently and used his own jacket to create a makeshift pillow for her head. Then he sat back on his heels and tried to figure out what to do next. They were at least 20 miles from the nearest town, with no horses and barely any water between them. His own mount was exhausted and couldn't possibly carry 2 people that distance in this heat. The smart thing to do would be to leave her here with what little water he could spare and ride for help. But Sam knew she wouldn't last an hour alone in this furnace. That's when he noticed something glinting in the sand near where the stagecoach had stopped. A gold pocket watch lay half buried in the sand, its chain tangled around a piece of broken harness leather. Sam picked it up and brushed away the grit, revealing an inscription on the back that made his blood run cold. To Margaret Caldwell, from the Board of Directors, Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company, 1885. Sam stared at the watch in his hand, the weight of it suddenly feeling much heavier than gold should. Margaret Caldwell. He'd heard that name whispered in saloons and trading posts from Colorado to California. The Iron Lady, they called her. The woman who'd inherited her husband's struggling railroad and turned it into an empire that stretched across half the continent. She owned more miles of track than any man alive, controlled shipping routes that could make or break entire towns, and had enough political influence to move senators and governors like pieces on a chessboard. And here she was, dying of heat stroke in the middle of the Arizona desert, while he held her life in his calloused, work-worn hands. Sam looked down at the unconscious woman with new eyes. The expensive clothes made sense now, as did the fancy stagecoach and the papers he'd seen scattered in the sand. Those weren't just any documents. They were probably contracts worth millions of dollars, deals that could reshape the entire Western territory. He'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple rescue, something that could either make his fortune or get him killed. For a moment, the temptation was overwhelming. Margaret Caldwell's enemies were legendary, men who'd do anything to see her empire crumble. If Sam simply walked away, left her to die in the desert heat, there would be no witnesses, no questions asked. He could take the watch, the jewelry, whatever valuables she carried, and disappear into Mexico with enough money to start a new life. No one would ever know what happened to the great Margaret Caldwell, except that she'd vanished somewhere between Tucson and Phoenix. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Sam felt sick with shame. His father had been a poor man, worked himself to death trying to make an honest living, but he'd raised his son to believe that a man's character was measured by what he did when nobody was watching. Leaving a woman to die, regardless of who she was or what she owned, wasn't something Sam could live with. He tucked the watch into his shirt pocket and turned his attention back to keeping Margaret Caldwell alive. Her breathing had grown more labored, and her skin was taking on a dangerous gray pallor beneath the sunburn. Heat stroke could kill quickly, and she was already showing the warning signs. Sam had seen men die from it on cattle drives, strong cowboys who'd simply pushed too hard in weather like this. Using his hat, Sam tried to fan some air across her face while he considered his options. The nearest town was Bitter Creek, about 15 miles southeast, but that was across some of the roughest country in the territory. There was an old mining camp called Devil's Backbone closer, maybe 10 miles north, but Sam wasn't even sure it was still occupied. Most of the mines in this area had played out years ago, leaving nothing behind but empty shacks and poisoned water holes. Then he remembered something his father had told him about reading the land, about how water always found the lowest places and left signs for those who knew how to look. Sam studied the landscape around them, noting the way the rocks were stained and the pattern of vegetation, sparse as it was. There, maybe 200 yards to the east, a line of slightly greener brush suggested water might be found if a man knew how to dig for it. It was a desperate gamble, but staying here meant certain death for both of them. Sam gathered Margaret's belongings and lifted her again, struggling across the uneven ground toward the line of vegetation. His own thirst was becoming unbearable now. His tongue swollen and his vision starting to blur around the edges. Each step felt like walking through molasses, and twice he nearly dropped her when his knees buckled. When he finally reached the spot, Sam laid Margaret down in what little shade he could find and began digging with his bare hands. The sand was hot enough to burn his palms, but underneath it the earth was slightly cooler and held together better. 3 feet down, his fingers found moisture. 4 feet down, muddy water began to seep into the hole he'd carved. It wasn't much, barely enough to cup in his hands, and it tasted of alkali and minerals that made his stomach clench. But it was water, and water meant life. Sam soaked his bandana and used it to wet Margaret's lips, then managed to get her to swallow a few precious drops. He allowed himself one small mouthful, just enough to wet his throat, then saved the rest for her. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Margaret Caldwell's eyelids finally fluttered open. Her gaze was unfocused at first, confused and frightened, but gradually she seemed to take in her surroundings. When her eyes found Sam's face, she tried to speak, but could only manage a dry whisper. "Easy now, ma'am," Sam said gently, offering her another sip of the brackish water. "You've had yourself a close call with the heat. Just rest and try to drink what you can." Margaret accepted the water gratefully, though she grimaced at the taste. After a few moments, her voice returned, hoarse but determined. "My driver," she managed to say. "Where is my driver?" Sam had been dreading this question. He'd found no sign of the man anywhere around the stagecoach. No body, no tracks leading away. Either the driver had abandoned her when the coach broke down, or he'd wandered off into the desert in a heat-induced delirium and was already dead. Neither possibility was something a dying woman needed to hear. "I don't know, ma'am," Sam said honestly. "It was just you in the coach when I found you." The horses were gone too. Margaret closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, there was a hardness there that hadn't been present before, a steel that spoke of someone accustomed to disappointment and betrayal. "He left me," she said simply. "When the wheel broke and the horses bolted, he took one of them and rode off. Left me to die." The matter-of-fact way she said it told Sam this wasn't the first time someone had betrayed Margaret Caldwell's trust. In her world of railroads and high finance, loyalty was probably just another commodity to be bought and sold. But it also told him something else. something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Despite all her wealth and power, Margaret Caldwell was just as alone in the world as he was. "What's your name?" she asked, studying his face with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every weathered line and sun-darkened feature. "Samuel Wade, ma'am. Most folks just call me Sam." Margaret nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. "Mr. Wade, I need you to understand something. The papers in my satchel, the documents you gathered from the sand, they contain information that certain people would kill to possess. Railroad contracts, land grants, mineral rights across 3 territories. If word gets out that I'm stranded here, vulnerable, there are men who will come looking not to rescue me, but to finish what the desert started." Sam felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. He'd suspected this woman was important, but the gravity in her voice told him he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. "What kind of men, ma'am?" "The kind who've been trying to destroy my railroad for years. Competitors who can't match my prices. Politicians who resent a woman holding power they believe belongs to them alone. They've tried buying me out, tried sabotaging my trains, even tried having me declared mentally incompetent simply because I refused to sell." Her voice grew harder with each word. "But they've never had an opportunity like this. Me, alone, helpless in the middle of nowhere with no witnesses." As the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky above the Arizona desert, Samuel Wade made a choice that would echo through generations. He could have taken the easy path, claimed the reward for saving a railroad heiress, and walked away. Instead, he chose to stay, to protect not just Margaret Caldwell's life, but her empire from those who would see it crumble. In that moment, beneath an endless canopy of desert stars, a penniless cowboy and the most powerful woman in the West forged an alliance that would reshape the entire American frontier. Sometimes the most extraordinary destinies begin with the simplest acts of human decency.